to my youngest son, 12 years old, which is right here behind the camera. How would I explain it to him? He knows and has learned in primary school and secondary school who Christopher Columbus was. He was one of the biggest conquerors and travelers of his era. He convinced the Catholic king and queen to fund his voyages, and the funding of such voyages was made dependent on the designation of the voyager as the new governor and admiral of the newly discovered territories. That's correct. Up to that point, we happened to came across accidentally of some extraordinary relevant documents we had heard of that we are now in a position to analyze and assess. Let me please briefly introduce myself. This is Pablo Gutiérrez Vega from my own office. I'm a lecturer of law at the law department of the University of Seville, and one of the disciplines which I teach to first year pre-graduate students at the law department is legal history. In my ordinary sessions, I do include Christopher Columbus on my academic curriculum, specifically when we deal with the birth, with the origin, with the transformation of the originally law of nations, which subsequently became what we now consider as public international law. Right behind me, you can see one of the monuments of Christopher Columbus in Seville, which, not being the only one, is by far the largest one. This monument is 45 meters high, as you can see, and it's here in the San Jerónimo Park, which is around a couple of miles away from downtown Seville. It's not obviously in any tourist plan, and as you can see, there's hardly no one here. And as you can see, has been in several occasions vandalized to steal the bronze and copper panels which cover the image inside. For centuries, the image of Christopher Columbus has been uncontestably depicted as an epic adventurer, man of science, and even as a loyal servant of the crown. His image, his life, his adventures were undisputedly iconic. Christopher Columbus was not a subject of the crown, but he actually died pleading against the crown. We are today in the courtyard of the Archivo General de Indias, the General Indies Archive from the late 18th century. This was not originally an archive, but is today world's largest archive after the US Library of the Congress. It's a monumental reservoir of documents pertaining to the Spanish monarchy, colonization of the new territories, with a chronological spectrum which ranges from 1492 to 1895. It can be visited. It is frequently visited by tourists, but it's probably one of the most cherished treasures of our documentary patrimony and heritage. It belongs to a network of public archives. I would like to bear in mind that this archive hosts and keeps some of the documents which are related to the Bobadilla trial, to start with the Capitulaciones de Santa Fe from 1492, but not only those, but mainly a wide range of documents pertaining to the so-called Columbine pleadings, which resulted from the Bobadilla inquiry and resolution in August 1500. We have here some representations of the conquistadores, and just in front of me we have one painting of Christopher Columbus, which was donated by the Veragua Duke in the 18th century, and right over there, among others, a more recent portrait of the admiral dating back to the 19th century, but we can find Alvarado, Bartolomé de las Casas, and other characters which are directly related to the colonization enterprise. Columbus did actually not turn back to Castile in 1500 on a voluntary basis, but quite on the contrary, as a result of a judicial inquiry on some of the most monstrous criminal charges which were conceivable at the time. He arrived to Seville, from where I am speaking to you, formally condemned after the so-called Bobadilla trial. This is a piece of information which is widely known in the scholarly world. The controversy I would like to talk about is the one about the accurate location of his corpse, of his bones, to be more precise, bearing in mind that the Dominican Republic claimed for decades that his body never left Santo Domingo. Back in 2006, a forensic team made a DNA test on the bones which lay in the Cathedral of Seville, and concluded, without any reasonable doubt, that those remains belong to Christopher Columbus. As a matter of fact, 2006 is one of the reasons I'm speaking to you. 2006 is the year in which rather accidental discovery brought up to surface documents which were known as existing, but which had never been located before. We have had the opportunity to study a transcription of those documents, and when I say transcription of the texts, I'm referring to the fact that although they were originally written in Spanish, the fact that they were written back in 1500 renders it almost impossible for an average Spanish reader to understand what's written in the document itself. The helping hand of a paleographer is hence absolutely necessary, and that's what we call a transcription. That transcription, which is available in various works which have been written ever since, is as well in this book, written by Mrs. Consuelo Varela, who was a senior researcher and which published a magnificent work on this particular topic called La caída de Cristóbal Colón, el juicio de Bobadilla, or The fall of Christopher Columbus, the trial of Bobadilla. We do have those papers, which are the copies of the testimonies of the witnesses of the Bobadilla trial. Mrs. Isabel Aguirre, who is, I think she still is, an archivist of the Archivo de Simancas, came across accidentally a legajo, an old dusty expedient among the thousands, if not millions, of documents which are distributed in different national archives in Spanish territory, primarily in Simancas, but mostly in the Archivo General de Indias here in Seville, which in principle looked like a copy of the inquiry that Francisco de Bobadilla had carried about in 1500 against Christopher Columbus. Bobadilla was sent by the King and Queen of Castile and Aragon to La Española. He had been commissioned to make a thorough research on the atrocities that were reportedly being committed by Christopher Columbus, and at the end of the day, Francisco de Bobadilla concluded that those atrocities, we can only describe them as such, even with extreme degree of carefulness in not being unfair with a retrospective view of what had happened, for some of those activities, as proved by Bobadilla, included summary executions, judgments without any warranties, the application of the death penalties without any kind of proofs, and especially I would like to end up with that, because we may now be sure that Christopher Columbus' plan was to enslave the highest degree of Indians as possible. And now we are in a position to declare that that plan existed, supported by the several testimonies of those who insisted on Christopher Columbus trying to prevent clerics to baptize Indians in order to enslave them and trade them across the ocean in Castile. This was suspicion over the last centuries, but we may now be almost sure that one of the primary objectives of the governor and viceroy of the Indies was right from the outset to enslave the Indians, transport them across the ocean, and obtain a benefit of such slave trade. That was the plan. Now, thanks to the Bobadilla papers, we do have historiographical evidences that we are still researching on. I would like you all to bear in mind that anyone interested with the legacy of Christopher Columbus has the opportunity to have access to most of the documents I referred to previously, particularly the Columbine pleading, which started right after the Bobadilla inquiry and ended some couple of decades after that, when Christopher Columbus had already died. The city of Seville is deeply enshrined in the Carrera de Indias, the colonial enterprise, whereby the Crown of Castile took possession of the newly discovered territories by Christopher Columbus, and ever since became the so-called Gate and Port of Indies. An apocryphal statement which has been attributed to Christopher Columbus and which is somehow represented here in this monument. The egg of Colon, or the egg of Columbus, and which does not have an equivalent in English. The concept of something which is easy to understand, but only when one has seen the demonstration. I think this paradox may be in a way useful to understand the scope and the length of the legacy of Christopher Columbus, which is undoubtedly huge in terms of geographic expansion of the known world of his area, but casts some doubts as to the manner in which he proceeded with the government of these newly discovered territories, and mainly with the treatment which the inhabitants of those territories received by the one who had become, thanks to the capitulaciones, his new viceroy and governor. I mean Christopher Columbus himself. However, as in many other cases, history has decided, probably quite unfairly, to attribute to the admiral the intelligence to have developed in a very synthetic way an explanation which is simple in its argumentation, but which becomes even more simpler once it's explained.